Welcome to the lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball, where we delve into the unsettling and mysterious tale of the Grieving. Prepare yourself for a journey into the darker side of this beloved cartoon series as we explore the eerie events that unfold in this chilling episode. One day, a little bumper showed up at the bottom of the screen during a commercial break. It said that a special episode of The Amazing World of Gumball was about to come on. The flashy and energetic intro theme played, although it was played a little differently than I recall. The music was a little different, and the show's logo wasn't animated, its colors were done rather sloppily as well, almost like something a little kid would do on a doodle board or a glow board. It began with Gumball, the show's 12-year-old protagonist, standing alone facing a corner of his dimly lit classroom. He looked absolutely miserable, a far cry from the cheerful demeanor he usually had. There was no one else in the room, not even his best friend and adopted brother Darwin the goldfish, and the windows in the room clearly showed the night sky outside. After about what seemed like a minute of Gumball standing somberly in the corner, the scene suddenly changed. We were in Gumball's house. Once again, the scene is silent and a little disquieting. Richard, Gumball's enormous rabbit father, walks in from the kitchen. He looked even more miserable than Gumball had in the previous scene. Richard isn't wearing his usual attire. He's dressed in a fancy black suit, a little uncharacteristic of him, as he's usually a slob. He sighs and slumps down onto the sofa and starts sobbing intensely, sounding like someone who had just lost something important. Newgrounds, the character designs were somewhat sloppy and rushed-looking, and the real-life backgrounds used for the show looked different. Poor Richard was still sobbing on the sofa as the front door opened suddenly, making me jump a bit at such a loud noise. And Gumball's mother, Nicole, a blue cat like him, stepped in. Like Richard, she wasn't wearing her usual outfit for some reason. She was in a black dress and was wearing a pretty black hat to match. Nicole sat down on the couch to comfort her husband, although she was looking a bit saddened herself. By this point, Richard's crying had begun to get more pained and miserable sounding. This wasn't the normal cartoon crying on the show. This was realistic and almost depressing crying. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the sad scene at their home ended as it shifted back to the school. We weren't in Gumball's classroom this time. We were in Principal Brown's office. Nicole and Richard were there, in their usual clothes, looking more normal and happy than they had before, but still slightly worried. Principal Brown, however, looked extremely sad. He quietly and somberly informed them that their children, Anais and Darwin, were not present after lunch earlier that day. They hadn't been seen at all the rest of the day. Nicole was instantly furious at him. She began spouting various insults and calls at him that I don't think would have made it on a more mature program like regular show. I was laughing at this because it seemed sort of funny for Nicole to flip out in this manner and start swearing like a sailor in a G-rated cartoon. But my outlook soon changed when Principal Brown told her something else after she finally had quieted down. His eyes began to tear up as he informed them that they eventually were found, but they had not been found alive. He then went into graphic and nearly nauseating detail describing how their bodies were found, their parents sitting in utter shock. I could hardly believe what was happening. How could such a cheery and fun kids show be taking such a dark and twisted turn? Another flashback. The scene was earlier that day, and the animation in this scene was even worse than earlier. He began his recollection by saying that the school had called the police department when they first turned up missing, believing that the kids had simply ran off and decided to skip school. They said it was very uncharacteristic of both Darwin and Anais to go skipping school like delinquents. Darwin was a little naive and a bit ditzy, but he was a good kid and wouldn't have even dreamed of doing something like that. And Anais was even less likely to run away. She was a straight A student, despite being only 4, which also troubled the police, seeing as a defenseless 4-year-old little girl was missing, as well as an older boy. The school had been thoroughly checked, so the police started to search the heavily wooded area outside of the school. It took little time for the police to discover the horrifying fate of Anais. In a small clearing outside of the school, Anais's head was found in a small box. You likely would have expected something like that to be shown in the show's cutesy art style, but it was nothing like that at all. Realistic blood covered the box, inside and out, while Anais's head was done in the normal style but was drenched in blood and some other fluids. Not all of them hers, apparently. There was a note in the box, seemingly written in her blood. It was never stated during the episode what exactly was written on the note, but it apparently led to the rest of her remains and Darwin's heavily mutilated corpse. All the blood and gore from Darwin and Anais's slaughtered and dismembered remains was done in a very realistic and disturbing way. It looked like the scene had been taken from a crime scene photograph done by a professional, not something from a cartoon. The way this scene was animated was different from most of the show as well. You may know that the characters from this series are done in vastly differing animation styles, from flash animation to CG. Every detail on Darwin's face was clearly illustrated. He looked a little like a zombie. His face was very pale, and his eyes had been gouged out by someone. Anais fared no better, or what was left of her anyway. She was naked, and her stomach had been slit open. Her intestines were strewn around the trees and bushes in the woods, done once again in a very morbid and realistic style. It was then I noticed that the show had been running twice as long. It usually ran for 11 minutes. But this episode was running for about 30. Gumball's parents were still talking to Principal Brown, so not that much. Nicole was asking him if Gumball was all right. Apparently, since she hadn't remembered him when Principal Brown told her what had happened to Darwin and Anais, he looked slightly confused and shocked for a moment, and explained to her that he thought Gumball was out sick today, and he had spent the day at home by himself with a stomach bug. Nicole screamed and wailed, while Richard quietly told him, in a very out-of-character voice, that they thought Gumball had got on the bus this morning, but it didn't seem that way. The police were called once again to search the building and the small forest outside of Elmore Junior High. They had found him in Miss Simeon's classroom, hanging by a noose, with a blood-covered knife behind him and blood covering his clothing. The episode ended with a shot of Gumball's dead body hanging there in the corner, fading to black. The credits rolled silently, not like the usual way Cartoon Network annoyingly airs a promo that squishes half the screen. These credits rolled unusually slow, and they weren't that fun to watch either. A little creepy, just plain white text scrolling on a black background. And with that, we conclude our exploration of the lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball. Join us next time as we uncover more mysteries and delve into the world of creepypastas. Until then, stay curious, and remember, not everything is as it seems in the world of cartoons.